Hello, my name is Christopher Renstrom, and I'm your weekly horoscope columnist here on Astrology Hub. And this time, I wanted to share with you a very special Christmas episode for Astrology Hub. This time, I wanted to talk to you about one of my favorite Christmas films, Miracle on 34th Street. The wonderful thing about astrology is that astrology is taking place in our lives all of the time. We're used to thinking of astrology in terms of the planets above in the sky and the different aspects that they make to one another in the sky and how that impacts us down here on Earth. We're used to think of astrology in terms of blogs or of columns or even books and magazine articles. But astrology, as I said, is happening around us all the time. And astrology has not only been communicated to us through the generations, through different books or teachings or pamphlets or things along those lines, but astrology has also been transmitted to us down through the generations in our cultures. I often talk about how astrology appears in churches and synagogues and houses of worship, how astrology has been associated to a calendar, and that's where the figures representing the different seasons, spring, summer, autumn, and winter, also appear in the zodiacal circle as represented by the different zodiacal symbols. But astrology has also been passed down through our art. Astrology has also been passed down through our culture. And if we look at certain things like, books or films, we can see the astrology speak to us pretty clearly. The reason I wanted to talk about one of my favorite films, which is Miracle on 34th Street, part of the reason it's one of my favorite films is because I lived in New York City for 28 years, and Miracle on 34th Street was filmed in New York City. So it's wonderful to see all the different areas that the characters walk through. But one of the reasons it's my favorite film, it's one of my favorite films, is because it really talks about the relationship between Jupiter and Saturn. This is a very powerful relationship that these two planets have to one another. We're used to thinking of Jupiter and Saturn as being two sides of the same coin, that same coin being the coin of fortune. On the Jupiter side of that coin of fortune, we have good fortune. We have a planet that's very expressive, a planet that's very welcoming, a planet that has a youthful quality that never really leaves, and a planet that really brings good fortune and higher purpose to all the lives that it touches. Jupiter in astrology will often represent goodwill. The flip side of that coin fortune is Saturn, Jupiter's father. And where Jupiter is very welcoming, Saturn is very withholding. Where Jupiter is very warm and congenial, Saturn has a tendency to be more remote and cold and austere. And that's because Saturn is the ruler of the two zodiac signs of winter, the third one being Pisces. But the first two zodiac signs of winter, of course, are Capricorn and Aquarius. So Saturn was seen as being the most distant planet in the original pantheon of 7 planets of astrology. It was the slowest moving, the most faded light, and it represented old age and decrepit people. People who were sort of seen as ill-tempered and grumpy and curmudgeonly and, a bit miserly or always complaining about aches and pains and things like that. Jupiter, however, Jupiter talked about people in their prime. There was always a robust energy to Jupiter. There was a generosity of spirit to Jupiter. There was a natural bonhomie. Jupiter didn't dwell on the negatives. Jupiter wasn't sarcastic or cynical or sardonic. Jupiter was spirited. Jupiter was optimistic. Jupiter believed in belief, and Jupiter had faith in faith. In this particular year, which is 2024, and on Christmas Eve, which is December 24th, 2024, Jupiter and Saturn will form a square in the zodiac signs of Gemini and Pisces. And I saw this as being really a lovely, wonderful fit with the film Miracle on 34th Street. Because with the Jupiter-Saturn square, what you really have is a conflict. You have a conflict between belief and faith, effervescence and magic, and disbelief, doubt, cynicism, and an unwillingness to believe anything that cannot be easily explained as a fact or a stat, as you could imagine. That's Saturn's camp. So here in this particular year, 2024, we have Jupiter in Gemini. And Jupiter in Gemini is very Santa Clausy, if you think about it. I mean, there's a twinkle in the eye. There's an eternal youthful quality with Jupiter in Gemini. There's a magnanimity. There's an abundance of generosity. There is good humor. And there is a child's sense of curiosity and wonder. And then we have Saturn in Pisces, which is forming a square to Jupiter in Gemini on December 24th. And here we really have a child that never had a childhood. As I mentioned before, there's a sort of remoteness or an austerity to Saturn in Pisces. Pisces, which is a zodiac sign that's so full of wonder and that's so full of magic, is left without those qualities when Saturn is here, either because those qualities never took root, they were never seeded, they never took root, they never flowered, or because those qualities of magic and wonder were perhaps crushed by difficult life experiences or challenging circumstances. For people who are born with Saturn in Pisces, there's often a feeling of having been, I don't know, an orphan who was left at the church doorstep. And they can have been raised in the most loving family ever. You know, they might have had parents who doted on them and siblings who simply adored them. But people with Saturn Pisces have a tendency to feel very apart, very like they don't belong to a family. They don't belong to a group of people. They have a hard time feeling loved. They have a hard time feeling appreciated. It's this sense, even if it never even happened, that they were abandoned on a church doorstep, that they weren't really wanted, that they weren't really appreciated. And so this theme of the eternal child, you know, Jupiter and Gemini, as embodied by Kringle, and Saturn in Pisces, as embodied by the 6-year-old girl, Susan Walker. This is how we begin our description of Miracle on 34th Street. Miracle on 34th Street was filmed in 1947, 2 years after the end of World War II. 2 years into what was really a prosperous cycle that was beginning in the American economy coming out of the Great Depression. At the beginning of the film, and as I said earlier, it is filmed entirely on location in Manhattan. At the beginning of the film, you're watching this figure from behind, and it looks like it's a dapper figure. You know, he's wearing a hat and a coat, and he's also carrying a cane. So you realize that he's an older gentleman, and he's walking through the different neighborhoods of Midtown Manhattan. And as he's walking through these different neighborhoods and stores, he stops at this one store and he looks down in the window and he sees this younger fellow who's setting up a window dressing. He's setting up a window dressing for Christmas. And in this window dressing on this shelf, and I think it's a store that's maybe selling jewelry or something like this, there's Santa in a sleigh, and the fellow is setting up the different reindeer that pull Santa's sleigh. And so the camera pans back to the older gentleman, and we see that he bears a more than just passing resemblance to Santa Claus, to Kris Kringle. He's not dressed in his Santa Clausian regalia, but he is very dapper. He has a long white beard. He's a little bit on the portly side. He's a bit on the portly side. And he's looking down, you know, scrutinizing the arrangement of the reindeer in this store window. And the fellow sort of looks up because he realized that someone's looking at him. And the older gentleman taps on the window with his cane and he says, "No, no, 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 no. You've got the arrangement of the reindeer all wrong." Dasher is my favorite reindeer. He's the fastest of all the reindeer. He's not going to be in the back next to me in the sleigh. He's going to be leading the rest of the reindeer. And Blitzen, Blitzen, you should know which one is Blitzen. Blitzen has an extra horn on his antler. He doesn't have the same antlers that all the other reindeers have. And you've got him on the right, and he's always on my left. And well, you've gotten Dancer and Prancer confused. Everyone confuses Dancer and Prancer. Dancer goes over here and Prancer goes over there. And the fellow's looking up at this elderly gentleman and he's like, okay, all right, and the older gentleman, being all sorts of irritated, and this is taking far too long, begins tapping at the door of the store itself. And it says closed, and the fellow says, we're closed, and we don't open until Monday. And he's like, but you have to turn these around. And he's like, sure, that's fine, old man, or whatever. And he's like, and finally, the older gentleman says, just trying to help you out. And he continues on his way. And the younger gentleman, sort of looks at him oddly because he does happen to look just like Santa Claus. And he goes back and begins to sort of rearrange the reindeer in the way that Kris Kringle had originally directed. So we follow this older gentleman, and we don't really know who he is yet, but you know who he is. And he's walking through the streets of Manhattan, and he comes upon the Thanksgiving Macy's Day Parade, okay? And he's come to the end of the parade. The parade has just started. It's snaking through the streets of Manhattan, just like it does today, and we know that it always ends by going past Macy's on 34th Street. But the older fellow is up here on the Upper West Side, which is the end of the parade. And he happens upon the Santa Claus, who's completely drunk. Okay, he's completely intoxicated, and he's like, are you supposed to be playing Santa Claus? And he's like, Santa's like, I've had a few to drink, and the fellow's like, yes, I can see that you have. How are you going to do a proper performance of Santa Claus if you're intoxicated like this? And he's like, I needed another drinky winky to stay warm, and Kris Kringle's like, this is impossible. And he goes and he looks for the event director of the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. And the event director's name is Doris Walker. She's played by Maureen O'Hara. And he says to her, listen, I don't want to be a bit of a snitch or anything like this, but your Santa Claus is completely drunk, and I don't think he's going to be able to perform. And, Doris's response is like, oh, no, not again. Like this happens every year, evidently, with their Santa Claus. And he's like, yes. And so they walk on back, and Santa Claus has fallen off the sled altogether. And he's like, face first on the street, face plant on the street. And Doris gathers him together and says, listen, you have to get on up there. And he's like, of course, and he's like, I can find my way up in the sleigh. And Doris throws the older gentleman a look, and she says, I know you've heard this several times before, but has anyone said to you happen to look exactly like Santa Claus? And the fellow responds, yes, and that's because I am. And she's like, you are? And he's like, yes, my name is Kris Kringle. Pleasure to meet you. And she says, my name is Doris Walker. Pleasure to meet you. Now, can I go ahead and ask you a tremendous favor? And he's like, mm-hmm. And she's like, is there any way that you could put the Santa Claus outfit on and be our Santa Claus for today? I mean, obviously you can see that our Santa Claus is very indisposed, and he's not going to make it. And you would be helping out Macy's, and you would be helping out the kids. And Kris is like, of course. I mean, like already breaking into action. He's taking off his suit and his hat and, kind of like investigating this Santa Claus costume, which he, finds kind of repulsive, but he's sporting and he's putting it on. And so he climbs aboard the sleigh and is ready to go on down the avenues, down to 34th Street. And so Doris, now that she's gotten her Santa taken care of and the parade is all taken care of, she's saying goodbye to everybody. And she's heading back down to her apartment, which is on 34th Street. It's around the store. And she wants to be there with her daughter, Susan, who's about 6, so that they can watch the parade together. And so she arrives at home and she's looking around for Susan. Susan's nowhere to be seen. And her maid says, well, actually, she's across the hallway at that fellow's apartment, the one who just moved in. I think his name is Fred Gailey. And she's like, oh, yes, yes. And she's like, well, what is she doing over there? And she said, well, Mr. Gailey came on over and asked if Susan wanted to see the parade from his apartment because it looks down on the street. And, she could see all the floats and things. And she's like, oh, okay, well, I'm going to go and collect her. And so Doris heads on over to Fred's apartment. And so in the apartment, we see Fred and Susan talking and visiting with one another. And Fred's like, oh, look at that balloon. Look at that float. He's an attorney. He's a defense attorney. And he doesn't have a girlfriend. He doesn't have a wife. He doesn't have a child. He's just moved in. He sees this 6-year-old kid. And he's like, you want to come and see the parade? And she's like, sure. And Susan actually is a bit of a critic of the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade because her mother plans them every year, and her mother probably talks about them every year. And so she's giving Fred the rundown on each of the balloons and and the people who are being represented in the parade and things like this. So Fred has learned rather quickly that Susan's not a typical 6-year-old girl, and she's not taken by the wonder of the parade, and she's actually doing a critique of each one of the features as they walk by. And he says at one point, he's like, oh, look at that balloon. That's a balloon of a giant. I bet there are giants who aren't half as big as that balloon is. And Susan, being 6, responds, well, Mr. Gailey, as you know, there are no such thing as giants in the world. And he's like, no such things as giants. Of course there's such things as giants. And she's like, please don't bore me. Or it's more like, please don't condescend to me or patronize me. There are no such things as giants in the world. And that's a balloon. That's not a very good depiction of a giant at that. And he's like, well, do you know about giants? And she's like, enough to know that they don't exist. And he's like, well, haven't you ever heard fairy tales? Like, do you know the story of Jack and the Beanstalk? And she's like, no, I don't. You don't know the story of Jack and the Beanstalk? Well, it's a story and he's about to tell the story when Doris comes on in. And she's like, oh, Mr. Gailey, what a pleasure meeting you. I'm here to collect my daughter. I hope she hasn't been too impossible. And it's like, no, she hasn't been impossible at all. We've been enjoying the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. And oh, look, there's Santa Claus, And so they go to the window and Doris is like, oh, that's a whole story in of itself. That's our new Santa Claus today. And oh my goodness. And what she notices looking out the window is that there is an extraordinarily large crowd of people that have gathered around Santa Claus. I mean, now that the parade is coming to a close and it's reached 34th Street where Macy's is, all of these people are filling the streets. They're looking out the windows, they're waving, and they're calling out to Santa Claus. And he's an enormous hit. I mean, nobody can get in and out of 34th Street because Santa Claus has arrived and everyone is just so taken with Kris Kringle. He's so charismatic. And so there he is waving to people almost as if he were a president in a limousine that was going down Fifth Avenue. I mean, he's just sort of waving to everyone and everyone is so delighted and things like this. And Susan, the little girl, Susan looks over and she sort of sniffs, Mom, that's actually a really good Santa Claus that you got this year. I mean, the one from the past couple of years has been absolutely horrible, but he's terrific. And she's like, he is, isn't he? And Fred turns to Doris, Susan's mother, and says, so Susan doesn't, and Doris says, believe in Santa Claus? No, of course she doesn't believe in Santa Claus. We all know that Santa Claus is a fiction. And nowadays with Macy's, he helps to sell toys, but no, Susan has never believed in something like Santa Claus. And so what we have a very strong sense here of is really kind of the Saturn versus Jupiter element of what's going on here. I mean, obviously Jupiter is going to be embodied in Kris Kringle, who's Santa Claus, who's very popular and everyone's coming out to applaud him. But we also see a Jupiterian element in Fred. Fred is kind of taken aback by Susan not believing in Santa Claus, or Susan never having heard a fairy tale or any sort of story that Susan has this very sort of realistic look at the world, but it's a child who hasn't been allowed to be a child. So it's an adult child, basically, or really, I guess what we could say, a child's version or an understanding of an adult. So Susan naturally pokes holes in all these sorts of things. She doesn't believe in Santa Claus or fairies or giants or anything along those lines. And she's happy to join her mother to go on back across the hall to their apartment. And what we really sort of take into account here is that her mother, Doris, is a single mom. She's a career mom. She's gotten very far in Macy's if she's the event director for the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. That she's a very ambitious woman. We never learn anything about Susan's father. We never learn anything about Susan's background. But we do know very quickly that Susan is more than just a sophisticated child. She's a child who isn't really a child. She's like a miniature adult. And that Fred is taking note that she's missing something from her life. She's missing the magic of childhood. Anyway, that doesn't keep Fred from having coached Susan to say to her mom, oh, could Mr. Gailey join us for Thanksgiving? He doesn't have a place to go in front of Mr. Gailey, so that Doris has to answer yes. And then Susan turns to Fred and says, Mr. Gailey, did I do that just right? Did I do it according to how you coached me? And he's like, yeah, kid. And Doris is like, okay. She's like, come on over for Thanksgiving dinner. And he joins them for Thanksgiving. Now, what happens is that not only is Kris Kringle very popular at this parade, but the Mr. Macy of Macy's has seen him on the streets and heard so much about him that he immediately hires him to become Santa Claus, the Macy's Santa Claus for the entire month of December. Okay. That he definitely wants this man to be the face of Macy's for Christmas. And of course, no sooner does he sit down and start to listen to the children than children line up. They line up, not only around the area of Santa's workshop, but they go down, they go through the floor, they go down the escalators, the line goes out of the escalators through the ground floor out into the street and around the block. I mean, this is a huge sensation. Every child wants to come and talk to the new Macy's Santa Claus. And of course, Doris is doing paperwork for Santa Claus, for Kris Kringle. And so she asks him his name and he says, it's Kris Kringle. And she's like, okay, no, your real name. And he says, it's Kris Kringle. And she's like, okay, and where do you reside? The North Pole, And he says, no, I reside at the Brooks Memorial Home for the Aged, okay, which is in a suburb outside of Manhattan. And she's like, oh, okay. And so she takes down that address and she fills out all of his information for HR and things like that for him to get a paycheck. And what's really brilliant about the way that the screenwriter has set up Miracle on 34th Street is that we're introduced to someone who, clearly, for all looks and appearances, is Santa Claus. He has that jovial Jupiterian spirit, okay? But he gives his address as a home for the aged, okay? And so we also get a touch of the Saturn as well. Saturn, as I said before, ruled over the elderly, and it ruled over the decrepit. It ruled over people who weren't seen as contributing members of society anymore. In fact, Saturn ruled over people who were seen as burdens on society. The elderly were regarded as burdens on society. There was a period of time when the elderly were revered, but at the time of this film, which is 1947, we have old age homes, which is where you park, your old dad or your old mom. And so Kris, at this old age home where he lives, they contact the head of the old age home and he shows up. And She said, we're just trying to get some background information on him. He's around children all day. And, what's he like as a person? Do you know anything about his family or whatever? And the head of the old age home says, actually, what's funny is that we don't know anything about Kris, other than he calls himself Kris Kringle, and he's been there since I can remember. And he's very genial. He's very friendly, as you can see. And she said, yes, yes. And I think he's wonderful around children. I mean, he would never be a threat or anything to worry about. And, I can't recommend him enough. I mean, when he's there at the home, he just has such a spirit and a welcoming energy. And everyone, I mean, even though it's a home for the elderly, they're all sort of transformed into children again when they're around him. And I'm sure he will have the same effect here with the children who are visiting Macy's. Coincidentally, downstairs from this interview that Doris is having with the head of the Home for the Aged, at the same time, Fred has brought Susan to see Santa Claus. Okay. He's not giving up on Susan yet. So he's brought Susan to see Santa Claus. And he's like, isn't there something that, you want to ask Santa for Christmas or something? She's like, oh, no, nothing so silly and ridiculous as that. And it's like, are you sure? I mean, look at all the different children that he's, granting wishes to and things like that. And she's like, oh, he's just going to say what he needs to say to make them feel good. And he's probably going to push a bunch of toys that, can't be sold onto them. I mean, he's kind of like a merchandiser, Mr. Gailey. I mean, that's who Santa Claus is. But nevertheless, Susan is taken by him, and she watches him from one of the wings where he's sitting with children, and he's talking to each of the children, and it's very clear that the children are, really, really happy with him. A very funny thing happens before a more miraculous thing happens. But the funny thing that happens is that there's a little girl that's asking for something for Christmas, and her mother, who's played by Thelma Ritter, fabulous. The girl wants this toy, and Santa says, "Oh, absolutely, I can bring you this toy. You can have this toy." And the mother's like, "Oh, did you have to tell her that? I've gone to a million stores and I can't find that toy anywhere. And Macy's doesn't carry it. And all you've done is that you've gotten her hopes up. Don't do that. You're just making more work for me, and I'm a working mother." And Kris says, "Oh no, you can get this toy that she wants at this particular department store." And he rattles off the address of it, and he's like, and they've got a large variety, and she'll be very happy with, and it's very affordable too. And so the mother's kind of taken back. She's like, "That store has it?" And he's like, "Yes, no, I absolutely know this to be true." And she's like, "Oh my goodness," So she departs with her daughter, and while she does, she walks by one of the managers of the store. And she says, "I want to thank you." And the manager of the store is like, "Oh, really? For what?" She's like, "My daughter really wants this toy, and I couldn't find it anywhere in your store." And he's like, "Yes, well, we're sadly out of stock." And she said, "But do you know that your Santa gave me the address of where I could go to get this toy? And for this price, isn't that wonderful?" And the manager's like, "He did. He's not supposed to do that." And the mother, having not heard him, said, "I want to thank you so much. I mean, for you to show that kind of confidence in your store and that kind of generosity at Christmas time. All the other department stores, it's not about the kids. It's about, selling their merchandise and product. But the fact that your Santa told us where we could find this, and that it wasn't here at Macy's, that you would have that kind of generosity of spirit, that you would be that invested in a child having a wonderful Christmas. I just can't tell you. I'm going to shop at Macy's from now on all the time because I just think you're so great." And the manager's like, "Okay, yeah, fine, wonderful." But he starts to hear from more and more patrons about how Kris Kringle is directing them to other stores. But what a wonderful thing it is that Macy's is doing it. And he's getting like a little nervous about it. But he kind of realizes, this might actually be a good thing. So why don't I think about this for a moment? The moment that really piques Susan's interest, though, she's watching the kids go in and out, is that there is a girl that is brought to Kris Kringle, and she sits up on his lap. And the mother says, listen, her name's, Elise or something like this. And she doesn't speak any English, not much English. She's a war orphan. We adopted her, and we just got her. And she really, really wanted to see you. I mean, when she saw that you were here at Macy's, she was saying Father Christmas, and she wanted to see you. And she doesn't speak any English, but if you just sort of say something encouraging or listen to her, that would be great. And Kris Kringle's like, absolutely. And so the girl sits on his knee, and he addresses her in Dutch. He just addresses her in Dutch. And she goes from looking very forlorn and sad to her eyes brighten up, and she like speaks Dutch back to him, and he speaks Dutch to her. And she, clearly she's describing the toy that she wants, and he's describing how she's going to get this and things like this. And he's asking her different questions, maybe about her family or background. And her eyes are brimming with tears, and she's smiling, and she's so ecstatic, and she's so happy. And Susan's watching this little 6-year-old Susan's watching this, and she realizes he's talking to her in her language, that she's completely understanding him. And that's not something that you get with a typical department store Santa. So Susan's like, she's impressed, and she's moved very deeply. And Fred is very happy that he brought Susan to see Santa that day. So here we have this Jupiter magic, which is being worked on the Saturnian, remoteness and closedness of this child. But we have to remember that Susan is a child that didn't really have a childhood, okay? Her mother had to work for a living. Who knows if she had been commented on by the other kids at school. And so she's reserved and keeps to herself. She doesn't really talk to other children, but she's taken in by Kris. Now, Fred, that night, hearing that Kris stays at an elderly home that's out in the suburbs outside of New York City and has to make the trek every day into Manhattan. And Doris is talking about that and kind of like, trying to think of what kind of living arrangements or something, because Kris is so popular. He's he's there right when the doors open. He's there right when the doors close. And so Fred's like, well, why doesn't he just bunk with me? He can be my roommate. He can stay with me here in my apartment. And Doris is like, really? And he's like, sure. And so they all have dinner that night together, Fred and Kris, who's delighted to be roommates with Fred, and Doris and Susan. And after dinner, Kris and Susan are talking. And what's so sweet is that Kris has taken an interest in Susan. He's noticed that she's very shy around him, that she doesn't really approach him. So, he's not trying to, make a big point of introducing himself or anything like that. But Susan sort of comes and talks to him after dinner, and she sits down with him, planning on having an adult conversation. And Kris asks her, how her day went or whatever. And she said it was nice, except that, there was this bad incident with the kids in the building. Not really bad, but something that, made her feel kind of uncomfortable. And he's like, well, what is it? And he's like, well, we were all playing, the kids wanted to play zoo. And so everyone had to come up with an animal. And he's like, oh, that's wonderful. What animal did you come up with? And she's like, human being. I mean, we're not animals, we're human beings, and we're supposed to be play acting an animal. I just thought the whole thing was entirely silly. And he's like, you thought it was silly? And she's like, yes, it was ridiculous. And so the kids didn't want to play with me. And it's no big deal. I didn't want to play with them either. And he's like, well, what animal would you be if you could be an animal? She's like, stop. And he's like, what animal would you be? They're not here. It's just me. And she's like, a monkey? And he's like, why would you be a monkey? And she's like, because they're fun and they're mischievous and things like that. And he's like, do you know how to act like a monkey? And she's like, and so what he does is he begins to scratch himself and act like a monkey, and he gets her to do the same thing. And this is just such a wonderful Gemini thing. This is what Geminis do. Not only are they natural icebreakers in terms of conversation and things like that, but there's this playful quality that people born in the zodiac sign of Gemini have. And here in our telling today, we're working with the idea of a Jupiter and Gemini. He starts playing monkey with her and she starts playing monkey back, and he wins her trust. They become playmates, they become buddies, and they really enjoy one another's company. And so what happens as he goes and he's Santa Claus during the day, he comes up and he has dinner with Doris and Susan at night. Usually Fred's there as well. And he and Susan become closer. So one night he asks Susan, does she want anything for Christmas? And she's like, no. And it's like, have you ever wanted anything for Christmas? And she's like, no, Santa Claus doesn't exist. I don't believe in him. And it's like, all right. But if it did exist and you did have a wish, what would you wish for? And she's like, well, it's not anything I can have. And it's like, all right, well, maybe you'll let me be the judge of that. And she's like, well, it's this. And she goes to her bureau and she takes out a magazine and she opens up the pages and she shows Kris Kringle a house. And he's like, that's a lovely little house. And she's like, it's my house. He's like, oh, it's your house. And she's like, it's my house. It has a swing in the back and it has a bedroom that could be mine, all mine, and it would be on the second floor and it would look over the beautiful backyard. And I just know that it exists out there for me. And that's what I would want for Christmas. And he's like, okay. And she's like, I guess that's too much to ask for. I mean, you're Santa Claus, so I guess that's too much to ask for. And he's like, it's a tall order. And she's like, listen, you don't have to pretend to be my friend. You don't have to pretend to be Santa Claus. I know you can't grant this wish, but you asked me, and I felt like sharing it with you. And he's like, okay. And she's like, are you really Santa Claus? And he's like, mm-hmm. I don't know. That looks like a pretty fake beard that you're wearing. And he's like, go ahead and pull on it. She's like, could I really? And he's like, sure. And she pulls on it really tight. He's like, and she's like, wow, it's real. And he's like, mm-hmm, just like Santa Claus is. And she's like, well, I think we can agree to disagree on that one. And so they both go to bed that night in their separate rooms and apartments. So what happens over a period of time is that Kris Kringle becomes even more popular than Macy's had predicted. His policy of recommending other stores where parents could get toys for their kids takes off. It brings in more customers than ever. There's newsreels done about it. It gets around town. Competing department stores are also coming up with their lists of other stores you could go to get to, because they're trying to compete with Macy's, which is clearly the reigning department store for the Christmas season, for that particular Christmas season. But it does come back that Kris is a resident at an old people's home, and there are questions in HR about what's his real name. He keeps saying it's Kris Kringle, and he's at this old person's home, and so they make arrangements for him to have to see a psychiatrist. And this psychiatrist is very annoyed with Kris Kringle. He's too optimistic. He's too bubbly. He's so irresponsible in the way that he talks about things. And so this psychiatrist really has it in for Kris Kringle. And so he's kind of blotting his record. He's saying all these damaging things. And people begin to have questions. I mean, because after all, this is someone who's around children all day. And there's one moment where Kris loses his temper with the psychiatrist because the psychiatrist says something that's really, really hateful and awful. And, he loses his temper, and the psychiatrist takes a note of it and says that he wants to give Kris an examination of mental competency. And at that point, when he hears about this examination of mental competency, he also hears from the psychiatrist who's been fraternizing with Doris that Doris doesn't really believe that he's Santa Claus and that she has her reservations about him. And he reports that to Kris in a very poisonous, toxic way. Even Doris, who is your neighbor and is supportive of yours, she has doubts and she doesn't really think that you're. And so Kris feels very dispirited, which is a very Jupiterian thing. I mean, Jupiter, when it's full of faith and confidence in itself, oh, it's magnificent. Okay. It's the planet of faith. It's the planet of belief. And you see this show up in people born under Sagittarius and Pisces all the time. When they believe in something, they absolutely believe in it. When they describe it, it excites you, it moves you. You can see these images in front of you, and there's no dispelling that belief. But if someone close to them questions that belief, or they hear of someone who's like, oh, my opinion of this person is actually contrary to what I've led this person to believe, there was no sign that can be so easily wounded, than a Sagittarius or a Pisces. To hear of a beloved friend or a loved one speaking ill of them. I mean, they'll get angry, it can have Sagittarians and Pisceans can have a stormy temperament, but there's a wound, they don't laugh it off. They don't explain it away. They don't say like, well, maybe it's because you've got this problem or something like that. No, they take it very personally, this lack of faith, this lack of belief in them. And Kris responds the same way. He's hurt that Doris, who has really subscribed to common sense, all right, just kind of finds the whole idea of a Kris Kringle something that you indulge for an old man who has no friends and who has no family, which is pretty much how it's put to him. And so Kris, when he takes this psychiatrist's test given by this evil psychiatrist, he deliberately fails it. He fails it because he's so hurt that Doris doesn't believe in him. He's so hurt that this little family that they had formed was really not real, wasn't really authentic. And he feels wounded. And so he deliberately flunks the test. And as a result, because of the machinations of this psychiatrist, he is immediately installed. He is immediately interned at Bellevue Hospital, which is a hospital for the mentally ill. He's immediately institutionalized. And so Arch Macy, who's been making all of this money off of Kris Kringle, is all of a sudden like, where did my Santa Claus go? Didn't show up for work today. And the psychiatrist is because he's mentally unfit and he's a danger to children and to other people around him. And I thought it best to institutionalize him. And Macy's like, institutionalize him? How could you do that without telling me? I mean, he's the best thing that happened in this store. And the psychiatrist is, I have a responsibility to the psychological health of the other employees and culture and environment or whatever. And R.H. Macy basically yells at him. He's furious, but he can't get Kris out of Bellevue because he's been properly admitted and they can't just bring him out again. Another person who's outraged by what's happened is Fred. He's lost his beloved roommate, and basically his roommate has been abducted and taken to Bellevue Hospital. Well, Fred is a defense attorney and he's going to get Kris out. And so he immediately starts applying himself to getting Kris out of this mental institution. But of course, what's keeping him in the mental institution is that he had failed this psychiatry test. So Fred has to sort of go one step further, all right? He has to actually prove that Kris really is Kris Kringle. And Fred's like, I'm going to do it. This is the guy who was talking to Susan about giants and fairy tales. This is the guy who took Kris in as his roommate. This is the guy who took Susan to see Santa Claus and see the miracle of Santa speaking to that little Dutch girl. And so he's like, he's kind of impulsive and carried away. And he's like, I'm going to prove that Kris Kringle is Santa Claus, and he sort of throws down the gauntlet. And of course, no sooner does he say that than it gets around town that not only, the story goes from, maybe a page 8 story of, Macy's Santa Claus institutionalized at Bellevue Hospital, okay, to front page story. This law firm that Fred works for is out to prove that Kris Kringle really is Santa Claus, and these are the court dates, and show up if you want to see a good show, And so it turns into that. Now, Doris, during this period of time, is really two minds about what's happening. She works for Macy's, so she wants to make sure that Kris is a great success with Macy's and things like that. But at the same time, as I've mentioned before, Kris is around children and other people. And if there's something about him that is iffy when it comes to his psychological makeup, she doesn't want to put him in a situation where he's going to be a danger to other people and to himself. So when Fred comes in declaring that he's going to defend Kris and prove that he's Santa Claus, she's like aghast. Now, during this period of time, clearly, as you could probably already guess, Fred and Doris have started dating, and they're getting very serious with one another. Fred is the lawyer and the great dreamer, but Doris has great ambitions for him. He's smart. He's really good and skilled at law, so she could see him going places. And now he's come home to say that he's going to defend Kris and prove that he's Santa Claus. And she's like, well, what did your firm have to say about that? And it's like, oh, who cares about the firm? She's like, what do you mean who cares about the firm? They're paying you as a lawyer. And he's like, oh, I can represent Kris on my own. And she's like, are you? And he's like, yeah. And she's like, and the firm, and he's like, oh, they're not behind it. I mean, they were like, this is crazy. I mean, if you're going to do this fool's errand or something like that, you're on your own. And I said, fine, I'm on my own then. That's what I'm going to do. And she's like, but is that practical? And he's like, of course it's not practical. It's not practical at all. But it's the right thing to do. This, Kris is Kris. You've spent time with him. You know that he's a good and wonderful person. And who's to say that he's not Santa Claus? And I'm going to go ahead and prove it. And she's like, I can't condone this. And he's like, what do you mean you can't condone this? And with all that sort of Saturnian energy coming forward, she's like, you're jeopardizing your career. You're jeopardizing the future of our relationship. How could you be so cavalier? How could you be so silly about this? And Fred looks at her and he's like, how could you not believe in him? You've spent time with him. We've had dinners together. How could you not believe in him? How could you not believe in me? And is this who you really are? You have these kinds of doubts? You don't believe in people? And she said, that's not the argument here. I'm worried about you getting disbarred. I'm worried about your future. And Fred's like, why don't you let me worry about my future? And she's like, it's just not normal. It's just not. And then Fred says to her the best line of the movie. I love this line. It's, faith is believing things when common sense tells you not to. All right? Think about that. Faith is believing in things when common sense tells you not to. And it's amazing. I mean, how many centuries have we spent like, what is faith? What is belief? What is prayer? But for him to just sort of size it up like that, faith is believing in things when common sense says not to. And this is the difference between Jupiter and Saturn energies. Jupiter is the faith. It will always be ruled by its faith, its belief, its enthusiasms. And Saturn, by the way, is not the great naysayer that everyone makes Saturn out to be, okay? Saturn does come down strong on the side of common sense. It is a planet which is about practicality and being able to take care of yourself. And that's because Saturn, being a winter planet, ruler of the two winter signs, Capricorn and Aquarius, is very scarcity sensitive, which, let's face it, Doris is on her own in 1947 with a child and no husband. What kind of ostracization has she received socially? The fact that she was able to get a job, that she's making her own money, this really speaks to the determination of a Saturn type of personality. It speaks to the sacrifice, it speaks to the hard work, to the discipline, and clearly her unmoving approach to the world in terms of seeing world as realistic. Okay, that's clearly based on pain, and it's clearly based on things that didn't work out in her life and that have left her with a very deep sense of disappointment and maybe even sorrow. So here she's opening up to a fellow and she's watching him throw it all away to prove. I mean, how many of us would be like, okay, now prove that this old man that everyone gets along with and is really sweet is Santa Claus? Like we would be like, I believe in this person. I want to encourage this person in his belief of himself and his journey of authenticity. But how many of us are really going to go and say, he's Santa Claus? Okay. So that's the step that Fred has taken that Doris can't take. But Fred leaves her with that thought. Faith is believing in things when common sense tells you not to. And that stays with Doris. What also has an impact on Doris is that night, Susan comes to her and she says, I want to write a letter to Kris. And Doris said, of course you can write a letter to Kris. And she's like, I want to tell him that I believe in him and that I love him and that I hope that things work out because he must feel very lonely, Mother, where he is being held in, what's that place called? Bellevue, and having all these people ridicule him. He must feel very lonely and bad. And I want Kris to feel good. I want Kris to know that I love him and I believe in him. And so she writes a letter, and it's very moving. She writes this letter to Kris, and Doris, at the end of the letter, she reads the letter because they're going to fold it up and put it on an envelope and send it to the courthouse. Doris reads it, and she writes at the bottom of it, Dear Kris, I believe in you too. And so they fold this letter up, and they send it to the courthouse. Kris Kringle at, whatever I forget what it was, the New York courthouse's address, that we see all the time in Law and Order. Okay, that they send it there. And what happens is that the letter gets taken to a post office, and there's a postal worker who sees it. And he's like, hey, Joe, Joe, his manager, I guess, comes on over and he's like, there's a letter here addressed to Santa Claus, and Joe's like, yeah, right. Like a million of them that we get every year. And he's like, yeah, but this one's got a real address. And it's like, what do you mean it's got a real address? It's addressed to the Manhattan courthouse. And Joe's like, oh. And he's like, are you thinking what I'm thinking? And Joe's like, I sure am. And he's like, all those dead letters that we have that have been addressed to the North Pole? Hey, if there's a guy named Kris Kringle and he's on trial, haven't you seen it in the newspapers? What? It's been on page one that, that Macy's had a Santa Claus and he's on trial and that's where he is. Well, then that's where we'll send all these letters that we've been sitting on to Santa Claus in the North Pole. Why send them to the North Pole when we can send them to the courthouse in downtown Manhattan? And that's exactly what they do. What follows is this trial. And it's a wonderful trial. I mean, it's really one of the great parts of the movie is how this trial unfolds with children testifying that that's Santa Claus and the district attorney's own child, looking at his father like, how could you not believe he's Santa Claus? It's hysterical and it's very funny and it's very loving and it's very warm-hearted. But at the end of the day, Fred cannot technically prove that Kris Kringle is Santa Claus. And that's what he needs to do if he's going to get Kris out of Bellevue, if he's going to get him released under his own recognition or recognizance or whatever they call that. And he's losing hope. He's been doing this sideshow with the kids, and people are like, of course he's Santa Claus. And R.H. Macy's is like, of course he's Santa Claus. If he says he's Santa Claus, he's Santa Claus. Even Gimbels has come forward and said he's Santa Claus, but they can't technically prove that someone calling himself Kris Kringle, who stays at this old age home, like in Queens or something, is actually Santa Claus. Until Fred hears from the post office. It's such a great moment. I mean, it's the moment of the movie. Okay, so the trial isn't going well. Fred can't prove that Kris Kringle is Kris Kringle. He's asked to step outside the courtroom for just a quick moment, and he says to the judge, can I take this message? And the judge, like, sure. And he does, and he comes back in, and he's like, okay, I have proof that Kris Kringle is Santa Claus. And the judge is like, okay, we've only been doing this for a few days. Why is Kris Kringle Santa Claus now? And what he does is that the post office has delivered all of the mail, which goes to Santa Claus at the North Pole, to the courthouse. And so they come in, and you see the court clerks coming in with, one or two bags. Others are coming in with one or two bags, 3 bags, 4 bags. All of these bags of mail come on in. Because finally the post office has somewhere to deliver them. All right. And so the judge is like, what are those? And it's like, letters to Santa Claus, letters to Kris Kringle. And so they're poured out on the judge's desk. And of course, it's a heap of notes and things like this. And many of them are now being addressed to the courthouse itself, and there's this outpouring of support, this outpouring of recognition by children in New York and actually around the country who are now writing Kris Kringle at the courthouse, along with all the letters that went to the North Pole. And so Fred's case is that if the U.S. Post Office, which is a branch of the U.S. federal government, believes that Kris Kringle is Santa Claus to the extent that they are delivering mail to him because they couldn't get him otherwise, and here they're delivering mail, this is the post office recognizing that Kris Kringle is indeed Santa Claus. And, it would be a felony for the post office to deliver mail to someone who wasn't who they were, And so Fred uses this as the coup d'etat. He uses this to prove that Kris is indeed Santa Claus. And the judge finds that he's Santa Claus. Everyone believes it, and they applaud. And that's the end of the case. He is free from Bellevue. What I love about this, and it shows the craft of a really great screenwriter, is that he leaves us always questioning whether Kris Kringle is really Kris Kringle. And here, on a technicality, he proves it. He makes the case for Kris Kringle in the guise of Fred Gailey, who's defending Kris and saying that Kris is indeed Kris Kringle. So here you sort of see this intersection between Jupiter and Saturn. Yes, a technicality was used, but if that technicality is seen as authenticating someone, why wouldn't it be used? And it's just so wonderful. And of course, everyone's delighted. They're all kinds of happy. And Kris invites Fred, Doris, and Susan to come celebrate Christmas at his home. And so Kris invites Fred, Doris, and Susan to come celebrate Christmas the next day. The trial is adjourned on Christmas Eve, of course. And Kris invites Fred, Doris, and Susan to come celebrate Christmas with him the next day at the Brooks Memorial Home for the Aged, which is in a suburb outside of Manhattan. And so they go. And, Kris is nattily dressed, and everyone at the home is so happy to see him back. And they knew all along he was really Kris Kringle. So it was never in question. And they're so happy to see him back. And they have this lovely dinner, and everyone has a wonderful time, except for Susan. Susan's looking a little bit sour, and she's looking a little bit disappointed. And Christmas dinner, back then was usually like about 12 noon. And so they're cleaning up after Christmas dinner. And Kris sits down with Susan. And he said, I got your letter. And she's like, you did? And he said, I did. I got your letter. And I read what your mother wrote too. And Doris is like, you did? And he's like, yes, I did. And I can't tell you how important that was for me. That gave me the faith to keep on going when I thought that everything was lost. And I want to thank the two of you so much for that. And Doris is like, oh, of course, Kris, we always believed in you. And Susan's like, yeah, we did. And Kris is like, Susan, are you upset about something? And she said, yes, but I don't want to be upset about it. And Kris is like, okay, what are you upset at that you don't want to be upset about? And she's like, it's stupid. And it's like, what is it? And she says, my stupid wish. And he's like, what wish was that? And she's like, I know you couldn't do it because I know you're not really Santa Claus and you don't have to be Santa Claus. You're Kris and you're Kris Kringle and I believe in you and I love you. But at the same time, I know you couldn't do it. I know you couldn't give me my house. And Kris is like, a house is a pretty big thing to deliver in a sleigh pulled by reindeer. And she's like, it was dumb. It was dumb of me to wish for it. And Kris said, it wasn't dumb for you to wish for it. You may get it one day. You never know. There's nothing wrong with wishing. And wishing is how things eventually materialize in our lives. And she's like, I know. And he's like, and you should never give up believing. She's like, believing in what? And he said, believing in your house. Never give up believing in that. That's something that you want. That's something that you believe in. And never stop believing. She's like, it was dumb. And he's like, it wasn't dumb. And she's like, like that. And so Kris is saying goodbye to the different guests who had come, and then he says goodbye to Fred and Doris and Susan, and he's like, listen, I know that you're heading back in Manhattan, and it can be a little bit dodgy driving back from here. So I've given you some directions, and if you follow these directions, you're going to avoid traffic altogether, and you'll get back in Manhattan like as soon as that lickety split. And they're like, thank you so much, because they hadn't been out here before and they don't know where they're going. And he's like, follow these directions and they'll take you right back to the city and you'll get there lickety split. They're like, great. And so they pile into the car and they drive back to Manhattan. And Susan's in the back and she's just kind of like looking gloomy and depressed, and her mom, Doris, is trying to make light of it. And Fred's like, wasn't that a wonderful Christmas? And she's like, I guess. And she's like, but you know what? I do believe. And they're like, what? She's like, I believe. I want to believe. I don't know if I believe, but I believe. And they're like, believe in what? Nothing. It's dumb. It's stupid. But I believe. I want to believe. I'm going to believe. And so she's having this sort of monologue where she's reciting the word believe and believe again and again. And they're driving through the different neighborhoods, because they're taking an alternate route back to Manhattan. And suddenly Susan is like, stop the car. And they're like, what? And she's like, stop the car, stop the car, stop it right now. And they stop it. And they're like, Susan, what is it? She's like, it's there. And they're like, what? And Susan opens up the door. She goes running out of the car. And like Doris and Fred are like, go get that girl. She's like running down she's running up a hill towards this house, which has a sign in front of it that says for sale. And this house is exactly the house that was published in this magazine. Susan's house, so she goes running into the house and it's for sale. And she opens up the door and she goes running upstairs and they're like, and Doris is like, Susan, this is someone else's property. Come on downstairs immediately. You can't, what are you doing up there? She's like, it's true. It's true. Everything he said is true. And she's like, what did he say was true? It's a bedroom, mommy. And it looks over the backyard, just the way that I said it was going to be. And she's like, Susan, please come on downstairs. And she goes running to the window and she's like, and there it is. She's like, what's there? My swing. And she runs out into the backyard to find her swing. And Doris is like, what? And Fred's like, I guess maybe this is what she wanted for Christmas. And Doris is like, but Fred. And he's like, well, we were, talking about getting serious and looking for a place. And last time I checked, there was a for sale sign in front of the house. And Doris is like, oh, Fred, please. That's ridiculous. Things don't just happen like that. And Fred's like, I don't know. Sometimes they do, you know. And they're sort of there mulling things over, and Susan's swinging on her swing, and she's all kinds of delighted. And their gaze comes over to the fireplace of the house. And next to the fireplace in this house is a cane. The exact cane that Kris Kringle has been carrying with him throughout the entire movie. There's a cane just sort of propped up there, almost kind of in a Tiny Tim sort of way. This cane is propped up next to this fireplace, and they look at each other and they're like, and of course, that's the end of the movie. I love this movie. I love this movie so much. And it's Natalie Wood's first role, I believe. She plays Susan, the 6-year-old Susan. Natalie Wood was 6 when she played Susan. And that house, by the way, that house is still there. Okay, I think it's in Queens or something like that, but you can go and see it. The house is still there. And it's had some adjustments and things like that, but it's still the same house. But what I love about this is that there's always this belief and doubt, belief, wanting to believe. Am I fooling myself when I believe? It just really raises these questions of the relationship between belief and doubt. A lot of times, particularly when we're talking about Capricorns, that doubt covers the fact that Capricorns are actually closeted believers. Okay. That not only do they want to believe, they do believe. But Capricorns have such a deep spiritual life, such a deep soulful life, a deep belief in things that they don't talk about it because it's sacred. Believing in something truly is sacred to a Capricorn, which is why they don't really talk about it that much. It's something that they hold inside in a sacred space, in a safe space within. What I love about this is that it's always being called into question, if he's Kris Kringle or not. And you end the movie and it doesn't matter. What matters with that cane propped up against the fireplace is the Jupiterian maxim of pay it forward. If someone does you a good deed in your life, you do someone else a good deed in their life. Not because it's reciprocal or you're giving back or you're paying back a favor. A complete stranger can do you a good deed. And the expectation is that you then go and do a good deed to another complete stranger. Kris Kringle is both familiar, we all know who Santa Claus is, and a stranger. Could it really be? He has to prove his identity, he has to prove who he is. It's proven, there's still question, because it was proven on technicality. But that's the wonderful magic of it, because that gets us to step away from proving whether there's a Santa Claus or not, and it gets us entering into the materialization of this house, the materialization of this home. And what I love about that, if you're familiar with planetary dignities, Jupiter is exalted in one zodiac sign only, and it's exalted in the zodiac sign of Cancer. And Cancer is the zodiac sign of the home, the hearth, family. And the cane at the end of the movie is propped up against the hearth. It's propped up against the fireplace. It's propped up against the place where stockings are hanging with great care in hopes that St. Nicholas will soon be there. And so he gives Susan her belief in home, and he gives Doris and Fred a belief in family. And it's up to them to make that happen, which again is one of the most beautiful things about Jupiter in astrology. Jupiter isn't about wish fulfillment. It doesn't just make your dreams come true. I mean, that's how we understand the power of wish and the power of visualization. You know, at Christmas time, we make requests for gifts and we get them, but we get them in a season of peace, of joy, of wishing good tidings upon other people, of wishing good things for the people that we know and love in our life, and wishing good things for the people that we don't know in our life, you know, who may never even enter into our life. It's a time of year that celebrates the humanity of humanity. And here what we see is that spirit of Jupiterian welcoming, of that Jupiterian hospitality, that thing that the planet does, which is create a place at the table for people who didn't have a place at the table. And if all the places are taken up at that table, it goes and gets another table and another table and another table out of that until you have a banquet hall, which is very Jupiterian. But I love this film. I love this film because it really shows the different guises or the different levels of Christmas, and that it ends with this beautiful image of hearth and home and a hope for a future, with this beautiful Jupiterian message of love and peace and goodwill, and that we are the agents of goodwill in this world. We are the people who make goodwill happen. And it's also a lovely reminder of that line that I just adore. And it's such a Jupiterian maxim. When we are faced with the steep challenge of showing goodwill, of showing belief, of showing faith in a world that doesn't often act that way, we are reminded of Fred's line, that beautiful line. Faith is believing things when common sense tells you not to. It's a wonderful message to live by. Happy holidays, and I hope you have a lovely and a blessed new year.
Well, friends, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Want more? Make sure you're signed up for our Cosmic Insider newsletter. It's free, delivered every Monday, includes links to all the episodes, plus you'll get a heads up on the cosmic weather ahead. Just go to astrologyhub.com/insider. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel to help us reach more astrology lovers like you. And finally, follow us on socials. You can find us on Instagram, X, TikTok, or Facebook for daily astrological guidance. See you soon.